Right, so the topic of our panel today is champions for species, of species conservation. As a bit of background, across Asia, species are at risk from broadly two types of threat: overexploitation for the illegal wildlife trade and habitat loss driven by large-scale conversion, deforestation, and land degradation. As a result, Southeast Asia has over 200 land and freshwater vertebrate species that are on the brink of extinction and categorized as critically endangered by the IUCN Red List. If we continue with business as usual, we are most likely going to lose a large number of species over the coming 10 to 20 years. We need to therefore start thinking seriously about what a meaningful and effective response should be to declining species populations. We are very fortunate today to have a group of extremely well-qualified species champions here and in our panel today who can help inform the structure of our response to the impending extinction crisis in Southeast Asia. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Jurgenne Primavera. Maybe you could raise your hand. She has been scientist with CIFTEC until 2007. She crossed over to the NGO community as Chief Mangrove Scientific Advisor of the Zoological Society of London. She led the ZSL community-based mangrove rehabilitation project. She chairs the newly established IUCN Mangrove Specialist Group. Also from the Philippines, we have Tess Gatan-Balbas. She has been engaged in conservation in the Philippines since 1996. From 2009 to the present, she's Chief Operating Officer of the Mabuwaya Foundation. In 2014, she was awarded the Whitley Award for Nature for her work on the endemic and critically endangered Philippine crocodile, one of the rarest animals on the planet. Then we have Dr. Ghazala Shahabuddin. Ghazala has studied extinction patterns and processes in butterfly assemblages in fragmented tropical forests in Venezuela. She's currently working with Center for Ecology, Development and Research in India. She has extensively researched the impacts of forest resource extraction and land use change on native forest bird communities in India within the context of diverse governance regimes. We have Dr. Mirza Kusrini. Miki is lecturer in the Department of Forest Resource Conservation and Ecotourism at Bogor Agricultural University, Indonesia. She is an enthusiastic advocate of amphibian and reptile conservation and serves as chair of the Indonesian Herpetological Society. Her research is mostly on the biodiversity and ecology of amphibians. Mirza is also passionate on conservation education for children. We have Dr. Kalyar Platt. Kalyar grew up in Yangon, Myanmar, and went on to get a PhD in Thailand. Currently, she spearheads the Turtle Survival Alliance's Myanmar program. Kalyar has worked tirelessly to pull the Burmese roofed turtle back from the edge of extinction. She received the 10th Annual Bila Conservation Award in 2015 for her extraordinary efforts in promoting the recovery of critically endangered turtles in Myanmar. We have Kanitha Krishnasamy. She has been active in conservation for the past 14 years. She's currently leading Traffic Southeast Asia's technical program on the region's most critically threatened species. Kanitha has a wealth of knowledge on wildlife, trade, and regional conservation policy. Prior to joining the Traffic Southeast Asia team, Kanitha worked with the Malaysian Nature Society for 7 years, after which she served on its board for 2 years. I think I've introduced everyone, and I will now let Reuben take this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madhu. Good morning to all. It's a great pleasure to be on stage with 5, 6 conservation warriors, and I think we have a combined experience of about 200 years in conservation, maybe. So there's a lot to learn from you. And working in Asia is especially difficult because of rapid development, and also being a woman can be very difficult sometimes. I have one woman on my team at the moment. She's my technical advisor. She advises me in everything. So it's great to have many more women in conservation. I'm going to start off with Kanitha, because I work closely with Kanitha in Malaysia. And Kanitha, we work on a critically endangered species, the tiger. It's not doing too well. You work in traffic, you have a lot of data on critically endangered species. Can you give us an idea of how they're doing in the region, the illegal trade of endangered species? Do you see it going down a lot? Can you give us some idea on the scale and the volume of the trade?
Hello? Yeah, so the situation is not doing well for pretty much all species. And you know, the critically endangered ones like tigers, for example, Sumatran tigers, Malayan tigers. The Malayan tiger was upgraded to be critically endangered last year, and it's not doing well. It hasn't been doing well for a very long time. Indonesia, for example, has seen the highest number of tigers being seized in the last 4 years. It works out to about 16 tigers a year, which is extremely high for a critically endangered species. The situation is the same in Malaysia. Malaysia seized about 100 tigers in the last 10 years, which, considering the very small population within the country, it's a serious issue. Other well-known species like pangolins, for example, they were doing, in the past in Southeast Asia, seizures ranged to up to a ton. More recent seizures, you don't see such high numbers. Numbers in Malaysia, for example, at most reaches 150 compared to, you know, in the tons when they used to turn up in seizures. Indonesia seizing a lot more pangolins compared to other countries in the region. But as a result of the trade with Asian pangolin species, 2 of them have been upgraded to critically endangered. And what we're seeing now is, because of this high demand for pangolins still, particularly coming from East Asia, a lot of the African pangolins are being targeted. So countries like Malaysia and Singapore, for example, are seeing African pangolins coming into the country, being shipped together with ivory. Speaking of ivory, I mean, the debate about ivory and rhino poaching, for example, has been ongoing, probably dominating a lot of the discussion about illegal wildlife trade globally. And Southeast Asia plays an extremely important role where this is concerned, both as a consumer, a lot of that going to East Asia and countries in Southeast Asia. Top on the list is Thailand. And Southeast Asia also plays a huge role as a transit country. So countries like Malaysia, like Singapore, like Vietnam, they are a huge country where transit is concerned. They are an important country where transit is concerned, because large numbers of ivory, large volumes of ivory, recording up to several tons. Malaysia, for example, over 16 tons of ivory was seized in the country, but more importantly, over 40 tons had passed through the country undetected. So this really points to a huge problem where trade routes are concerned, because it's not just about what's happening within a country where consumption is a problem within a country, but it's also facilitating a lot of the trade from all around the world. So the trade routes, I think it's very difficult to say what the trade route is like for a particular species. You can do that to some level, but trade routes in general, they're all over the map, from Africa to Southeast Asia. A lot of Southeast Asian reptiles, particularly from Indonesia, for example, is highly priced in the EU and in the US for pets. So that's, you know, it's a huge problem globally, and it's something that Southeast Asia is grappling with more than most other regions, I think, because, as you said, the development pressures are increasing, threats to species are also increasing, and consumption and overexploitation, especially with new money Asia. Everybody wants what they can't get, what they shouldn't be able to get.
Thanks, Kanitha, for the overview in Southeast Asia. Let's jump into the Philippines for a moment. You work in a biodiversity hotspot, and you work on a critically endangered crocodile. And can you give us an idea of how other critically endangered species in the Philippines are doing at the moment?
Yeah, thanks very much, Reuben, and thanks everyone for coming. Well, the Philippines has more threatened endemic species per area than any other country in Southeast Asia, including a very high number of endemic endangered species. I work in one of the largest protected area, and therefore you could see like vast number of critical endangered ones. For example, is the Philippine eagle, the Isabella oriole, and the last wetland you can see our critically endangered Philippine crocodile. However, habitat loss is one of the greatest challenge we have. Illegal logging is still happening in the Philippines, and there is no enforcement of the law. Crocodile killings are still happening, and nobody is being punished. What we want to do now is for the government to have really very serious commitment on the protection of these species, because right now politicians are really focused on development, and we need to change that into a sustainable development.
So let's zoom out a bit to the habitat, Jurgenne. You work in mangrove habitats. Can you tell us some trends about how mangroves are doing in the Philippines?
So, unlike the others here, where we have specific taxa being discussed, mangroves, it's the whole ecosystem, because there are so few species, maybe 50 to 70 of them, due to the extreme nature of the environment. So it's the whole ecosystem, and especially given the importance, for coastal protection with all the typhoons, storms coming in, and with climate change, the importance of carbon sequestration. I think in IUCN last year, a meeting in Abu Dhabi started to discuss the possibility of looking at endangered ecosystems, starting with mangroves rather than specific species of mangroves. So, in general, mangrove loss, I'm talking both of the Philippines and the region, Southeast Asia, is not as, the rates of loss are not as high as before, where they were like 1% per year. They're now down to maybe less than 0.2% per year. But looking at the drivers of the loss, the trend, the increases are bound to happen, because whereas before we had aquaculture, mainly shrimp culture, and those of us in South and Southeast Asia know about this, that have laid waste to thousands of hectares of mangroves. Now we have, this is a paper by Richards and Danfries of NUS. We have oil palm coming up in Malaysia, Indonesia, and rice production in Myanmar as drivers for mangrove loss. And if these drivers are not addressed, then the gains that we have, of reducing loss from aquaculture, then we have mangrove hectare rates still going down on the whole. And one last thing I have to mention is that Southeast Asia has the most number of species, 40 of the 70 or so species of mangroves worldwide, and a third of the hectare rates. So given, the typhoons, which are also called hurricanes in South Asia, and cyclones in the Americas, increasing in frequency and intensity. In the Philippines, with Haiyan, we had maybe 16,000 people died with Haiyan. But perhaps if we consider Myanmar, 100,000 people died with Nargis. And in South Asia, 300,000 people died per cyclone. So this is really, really, mangroves are the front line of defense for cyclones, because they're between land and sea, and that's where typhoons make first landfall. So the importance of mangroves cannot be really underestimated.
Thanks, Eugene. Let's cross over to Myanmar for a bit. It's a very dynamic country at the moment, Kalyar. You hear a lot of stories about tigers disappearing very fast in Myanmar, but how are the turtles doing? What do you see about the trends over the next 10 years?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And in Myanmar, for freshwater, turtles and tortoises, We have our total 36 species there, and about one-third of them are endemic species, and about 50%, half of our species are already facing critically endangered situation, unfortunately. And because of the main reason, it's because of international pet trade. Like the Burmese tortoise, it's because of, you know, the beautiful creature, so pay a lot of money for that, so it's about become ecological extinct. And other species like the Burmese roof turtles, those are very low numbers, very small population left in the wild. But that species, it's because of a long-term egg collection, you know, so it depends on each species has a different kind of threat, but most because of the illegal wildlife trade and pet trade, and it's because of some species look very bizarre looking, like a big-headed turtle. So they pay a lot of money to buy for the collection. So because of just trade is driving the Burmese species going to be extinct.
Mickey, in Indonesia, you work in Indonesia and you work on amphibians. Can you give us an idea about the trends for amphibians, especially the critically endangered species?
Okay, thank you, Reuben. Hello, good morning, everyone. So I'm working with amphibians that in Indonesia, what we know of is now about 400 species. So it is quite a lot. But when we think about what we know about the amphibian, is very low. Only 3 species is critically endangered, and from these 3 species, only 1 is studied well. The other 2, one is probably already extinct, the Shahabuddin, and Bufo sumatranus, nobody really looked into it. Although that half of the species is less concerned, but still we don't know much about them. One of them is actually harvested as frog legs, and Indonesia is one of the biggest exporters of frog legs in the world. So it's millions of frogs is captured from the wild, mostly go to Europe. And the problem is that we don't really know whether it is sustainable or not. I did the research 10 years ago on one species, and because the species is live in the rice field, it seems like it's still okay. But then we still have several species, the big one, that is also being harvested, and we don't know anything about that. So what I'm worried about in Indonesia is not only the driver of loss, like we already talked before with the panelists, like, you know, the expansion of oil palm or the change of habitat, pollutions. But the thing is, like, we don't almost not know nothing about them. So if we lose the habitat, we probably also lost the species that we don't know anything about it, because nobody really looked into. I remember when I started doing study on amphibians, somebody asked me, because at the time there's talk about the global amphibian decline, and they asked me, what happened in Indonesia? Is there any population decline? And I said, like, look, we don't even know what we have. So probably we have the population decline, but we don't know. So that's one thing that I'm thinking is very sad, that to know that they need more research or people doing to know what we have in Indonesia in terms of amphibians.
So clearly we need more reinforcement in Indonesia.
Yeah.
So let's jump to South Asia and India. Ghazala, so how do you see the trends of critically endangered species in India at the landscape level? What's your prognosis for such species?
So we often pride ourselves in saying, in the fact that we haven't had too many species extinctions in historic times, apart from the Asiatic cheetah and perhaps the Javan rhinoceros and so on. But today, one would like to revisit that and say that we have many species on the brink of extinction. We have been successful in bringing back the Bengal tiger and the greater one-horned rhinoceros back from the brink due to concerted conservation efforts, consolidating the habitats and really doing strict law enforcement. But there are several and probably hundreds of species that are really on the brink. Recently, it has been, the status update is that we have 200 to 300 individuals of the Ganges gharial, which is a very sensitive species, restricted to fast-flowing rivers in the northern Indian subcontinent. We have about 200 or 300 individuals of the pygmy hawk, which is restricted to the grasslands, the wet grasslands of the upper Brahmaputra plains. We have the great Indian bustard, which we are literally seeing going extinct right before our eyes with very little that we can do about it, since we know very little about the species biology and we don't know how to breed it in captivity. So we have a situation where I think if we don't do anything for all these other species, we're going to see a series of extinctions over the next 20 years. Having said that, I think we are stepping up to the challenge. We've started captive breeding for many species, and we have to see how the habitats can be saved as well. I would just like to point out that certain groups, I think, are especially vulnerable. The habitat specialists that nobody cared about for a long time, like the semi-arid, the ones living in the semi-arid grassland, freshwater ecosystems, which are really, really difficult to conserve because you have to take large landscapes, large catchments into account. So I think freshwater specialists, semi-arid grasslands, coastal species like the dugong, where very, very few people actually go, these species are in particular danger.
So let's have a, next section we're going to have an idea of, get your inputs on what has worked in your countries, some of the successes, some of the failures, and what we can learn from that. Let's move back this way and start with Ghazala again. So do you think a landscape level approach for conservation is a much better method to adopt in India, for example? Or do you think a targeted approach?
I think when a species is in relatively safe ground, like we had the tiger was down to about 1,500, which is still a good number to work with. You really need to, you can start with doing habitat conservation and so on. But now we're at a situation where we need species-specific conservation plans, and also we need to complement that with habitat conservation. So for instance, the Asiatic lion, we've been very successful in bringing it back from perhaps 300 to 400 in the 1970s to almost 5 to 600 today. And they're literally spilling out from the protected area, and the government is talking about relocating them to newer areas in the semi-arid scrub forest zone. So I think that is a possibility for species that have a high reproductive rate, that are relatively tolerant of human presence and so on. But for the really sensitive species, we have to go into species-specific conservation plan, and for that we need good science, which is not always available in India. We do not reach out to the specialists, the scientists that have experience, and I think we are facing that problem with the great Indian bustard, which is proving very difficult to breed in captivity, but the government hasn't really reached out to the international experts who've actually bred it. So we need a lot of work on that front.
Can you give us some idea of the obstacles, the challenges you face in amphibian conservation? Do we need a more specific approach?
Yeah, in terms of the amphibians, so far what we have is almost conservation action is based on landscape. So if the habitat is protected, we are hoping that the amphibian will be all right there. But again, as the panelists before saying that we need, if we go to species-based conservation, we need good science, and that's what is actually lacking in Indonesia. Some of the species might be in a good habitat, like the one that I work on, but we know that they are vulnerable because probably it's disease or the possibility because they live in the volcanic area, they might be go extinct if something's happened. So good science is really needed for that.
Kanitha, tackling the illegal wildlife trade is a huge task. Where do we start? What are some of the obstacles we are we facing in the region to address this threat?
I think the biggest challenge we face right now is an enforcement issue. To some extent, well, the root cause really is an attitude problem. People have no regard for law and order. They think that they can do whatever they want to do. A couple of months ago, a guy in Malaysia was arrested because he got on his bike, drove to town with a tiger on his back. I mean, it's 2016, how is that acceptable, riding to town with a tiger on your back? And that's what people are doing, you know, they're just so bold, they're not concerned about getting caught. Well, unlucky for him, he got caught. But it is a serious enforcement issue. Everybody talks about tigers so much so often. You would think that there's a lot of effort, well, to some extent there's some efforts, but there isn't sufficient resources to invest into critically endangered species like the tiger. In Malaysia, that is definitely a challenge, a setback. There isn't enough money for tiger conservation in Malaysia. I think the world views Malaysia as a rich enough country, and the assumption is that there should be enough money to save tigers in Malaysia. And that's just not an issue just for tigers. I think very often a lot of the more high-profile species like tigers, elephant, rhinos get that attention and they get that sort of public sympathy. But I think what we also need to look out for is the lesser known species that may not be critically endangered at this point in time, but tortoises like the black spotted tortoises from South Asia, in star tortoises from South Asia, they're not critically endangered. In fact, they rank very low in the threatened rank where IUCN is concerned. But they're turning up in extremely huge volumes around the world in seizures. And I think if you don't watch that space and take conservation measures and enforcement actions right now, species like this that are considered vulnerable or least concern can very quickly spiral into critically endangered species. In Borneo, the earless monitor lizard, not many people have heard about it. For about 100 years, I think maybe there are about 5 observations in the wild. Somebody researchers in 2012, when they found it, they wrote about it. They talked about the location where it was found. All of a sudden, everybody's gone and collected it. It's totally protected in Borneo where it occurs, but people are trading in it in Japan, in the EU, in the US. So I think while there's been some attention being invested for critically endangered species, we have to look at trade patterns gives you an idea of what else is happening with other species that are also endangered, and we need to make sure that enough effort is invested into these species that they don't become critically endangered species. I mean, Madhu mentioned earlier over 200 species in Asia are critically endangered. We don't want to increase that figure. We want to try and reduce that number.
So resources are clearly a constraint, manpower, funding. Eugene, how do we save uncharismatic habitats like the mangrove? What are challenges do you face? What are obstacles, and what has worked in your area?
We have successes and we have failures. First is protection, is a success, where we have mangrove eco parks. Given that mangroves capture carbon at 4 to 5 times the rate of terrestrial forests, really fantastic carbon sequestration, then remaining mangroves, the default should be really to protect them. We have eco parks in the Philippines, not enough, but at least there are some successes. Sungai Buloh here, and in Malaysia, you have the firefly place, really nice, and I guess in some other Asian countries, but there should be more of them, protection. And mainly, rehabilitation is needed because there's been so much degradation of mangroves that we need to bring them back. Except that most rehabilitation or replanting has been along the seafront, which is suboptimal, but it's open access, no socio-political conflicts, but ecologically challenging. But then, the money goes to you avoid the conflicts. So that's where for the past few decades, maybe 3 decades now, external funding in the millions of dollars for mangrove rehabilitation from the banks ADB, World Bank, JBIC have gone to seafront planting despite the low survival rates. So that's really mainly a failure, but it still goes on and on because the definition of success is really the percent of quota attained. Like you target 1 million hectares or 1 million mangrove propagules. If you plant 900,000, then you're 90% successful, rather than the number of mangroves that survive to maturity, the number of hectares of forests that are produced. This is still ongoing among governments, the definition of success for reforestation. And also, in the reports of the development agencies, you go to ADB, you track down a multi-million project, and there's not a single line on percent survival rate of the mangroves that were planted. So that's millions of dollars over 3 decades going to seafront planting. A subset of that is seagrass planting, because that's mangroves are middle to upper intertidal. Seafront planting is lower intertidal. In many cases, seagrasses are there. So in the Philippines, there was this rise over just 5 years, a doubling of the hectareage of mangroves in the Philippines. And we mangrove scientists were wondering, we go to the field every month, every week, and we didn't see such a rise. And it turns out that these were the plantations on seagrass beds. Because if the seafront, the beaches are no conflict, open access areas, all the more the seagrass beds, nobody sees them. So at a certain point, around 2000, the satellite imagery was capturing all these squares, very regular squares in the middle of the ocean. Yeah, so I said, wow, 100,000 hectares in the Philippines over just a few years, and maybe half, 50,000 hectares on seagrass beds, which is really robbing Peter, the seagrasses, to pay Paul, the mangroves. Is that correct? And this has been going on, and this is supported by governments and by all these banks that give funding. So I don't know in your countries, but in the Philippines, definitely I know that it's there. So this is mixed for me, a success in that, yes, the mangroves have increased, but a failure in that what happens to the dugongs, to the sea turtles, to the seahorses, and all these unique fauna that are associated with sea grasses. Now lastly, a success, but not enough of it is happening, is the reversion or rehabilitation of abandoned ponds. In Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, hundreds to thousands of hectares of abandoned shrimp and fish ponds. This is where the millions of dollars should be going, but policymakers are keeping distance from this, at least in the Philippines. Why? In the Philippines, fish ponds are life and death. You go there, you can get shot at. And this has happened to development workers, they go there and they get shot at. The ecology of reversion of abandoned ponds is very easy. You just break the dikes, the water, the tidal flow comes back, the seed sources are there, and voila, the mangroves return. So ecologically, very easy, but sociopolitically, very difficult because of tenure. And this is where you can get shot at. And this is, I think, I'm jumping to policy, but anyway, that's the challenge. It's the big challenge. We mangrove scientists have been saying this for, 5-10 years now, but nobody's listening because it's just very touchy. But with our new president, maybe if we can get his ear on law enforcement, hopefully, things will change.
Thanks, Jurgenne. Jumping to Myanmar, Kalyar, what do you think is the best approach to save a sensitive species like the turtle? Do you think we need more assurance colonies? And what is an assurance colony? Because some people might not know what it is. Can you give an idea what that is?
Yes, for turtles, we are very lucky to set up the assurance colonies. Like comparing other mammals, it's very for turtles, we don't need like huge space or something like that. And for example, for star tortoise, the forestry department confiscated 175 tortoises like 10 years ago, and we set up like 4 different assurance colonies. And nowadays we are producing about 4,000 hatchlings a year. And star tortoises, they adapted very well in the captivity, and they reach maturity in the captive breeding at the age of 6. And then one female will lay eggs up to 6 times. And one time, one clutches about up to 11 eggs. So, you know, because of their biology, and they increase our hatchlings, number of hatchlings every year a lot. So we now reach more than 10,000 star tortoises in hand so we can start a reintroduction project. That's we work very well. Success of the captive breeding, assurance colonies, and also in situ and ex situ conservation together. That we bringing back the species is going to extend. Is going to be extended very soon, like the Burmese roof turtle. It's only left less than 10 adults in the wild, but we protect the nesting niches and then collecting all the eggs and incubate them, and you know, when head starting, and then we did that Burmese roof turtle project about 10 years. Now we have about 800 turtles in 4 different assurance colony, and even one assurance colony set up in here in Singapore. And so let's say like in the next 2 to 3 years, they will start breeding, and then one female produce 30 to 40 eggs. So, you know, that way we are now, we don't have to worry too much about this species going to be a biological extinct at least. And we just need to try and harder for reintroduction to be more success. And some of the, you know, our species are very valuable, so still have a lot of threats, like theft problem. Then, you know, we have to address that. And the success is, assurance colony success very good. And also, one other thing is, like WCS has a, you know, a big project of one national park with like a tiger conservation or like elephant protection unit like that. And then they do the very serious smart patrol and monitoring like that. Then it's become like an umbrella conservation area. So this piece, the species, the turtle species occurred in those kind of protected area. Then we get a protection because patrol is, you know, very strong there. So that's success, more success in those areas.
Thanks, Kalyar. So some regions maybe you need a more strict protection approach, but Tess, you work a lot with the community. Do you think a community-based approach is also very important in conservation, or what do you suggest? What has worked in your area?
Well, as everybody, or maybe you know that the Philippines has a really good laws. However, despite these laws, there is a very little enforcement on the ground. So people don't know about their endemic species. People don't know what healthy ecosystems are for them. What we need to do here is to educate the people, let them know what they have, because if they do not know, they don't care. So what our foundation is doing is to work really very closely with the people. So it's a community-based conservation model on the Philippine crocodile conservation. So we start with a very small child up to the politicians. And through intensive communication campaigns, we were able to increase the crocodile population. We were able to increase crocodile sanctuaries. We started with 0 in terms of wetland conservation program. But because we are helping together or working together with the communities, less crocodiles are killed, number of crocodile populations increased, and there are more fish sanctuaries and crocodile sanctuaries, and I think that helps. What is good with the local organization like us is that we have a long-term program. It is not 5 years, it is not 10 years, but there is no ending date. What we see as a failure in the Northern Sierra Madre Natural Park is the coming in of a very large conservation project in which they have millions of pesos in such a short time. But has it made a difference? Hardly. So there are smaller organizations which are working on species in the Philippines, and we are focusing on education as our major activity, and we see it as it works. And just educate the people. For example, the Philippine crocodile, it's not very easy to tell the people to protect the crocodiles because they are not very charismatic as what flagship species are. But for me, who works with the communities, I tell them that this is what we have. We should not fear them, but we should be proud of it. Just tell them, this is a very small crocodile. They are small, they are shy, and they are very beautiful. So those kind of things, and it worked.
Thanks, Tess. So right now, I think we're going to open the questions to the floor, and after that, I'm going to ask everyone for some tips and advice you can give to young conservationists. So if you are going to ask a question, you want to ask them about, give me some tips on conservation. We're going to get some idea of that later, but if any of you have questions for our champions in conservation here, please come to the microphone and say your name and where you're from and ask a question. All right, Vicky, start the show.
All right, you should already know me. I have a question, I hope it doesn't jump too much on what you were gonna talk about later on, but one of the lessons that I like to come back to is, you got 200 years of experience on that stage, more probably. If you had one or two sentences that you could tell your 20, 25-year-old self to pay more attention to, what would it be? Anybody, anything passionate or anything really important that you felt like you missed out on when you were starting out in conservation?
I think the two key words I would emphasize is science and people. Really need to get going on the science part of it and do it with people. That's what's working in different places.
I think I just add also, be passionate. I mean, when I start doing amphibians, people is asking me, why are you doing work on some things that is not pretty? But I keep doing it, and well, it worked for me. And I guess when you're passionate enough, people will get attention, and also the species that you work on will get attention too. It's a really tough one.
Answer, Kanitha.
I mean, a lot of the challenges we face are directly linked to government policy, and I think anybody intending to work this really at the very beginning has to start working with governments because they are the owners, they are the custodians. In many places, in some places, NGOs or communities and research institutions have some power to do what they can do, but ultimately the governments have their ownership, and it's so easy to get frustrated with all the challenges and the bureaucracy, but if we don't work with them or find a way to influence them and make them think that what we're saying is right, and they should be supporting it too, I think it just makes things easier. Otherwise, we're just going to constantly be fighting this battle, and it will be an us against them. Very often that's the case, and I don't think that's the smart way of doing things.
Just to repeat science and people, in my mangrove work, the Z or ZSL mangrove projects in the Philippines are community-based. No? So we always work with the local stakeholders because they are the de facto managers of mangroves. It has to be the communities, otherwise it won't go. Of Of course, the governments are also important. In the Philippines, the mayors are king in their town, so you also have to, do this. But at the base, you have the people. Now, for science, I came from the scientific community and jumping to the NGO. When I see my colleagues who are about to retire from the academe, I give them this advice. In academe, you have plenty of science, but not so much money. In NGOs, they have plenty of money, but sometimes, often, not too much science. So join NGOs when you retire. That is my own experience. Of course, joining ZSL, which is not really a small NGO, has been part of the success. But let me just mention very quickly, where I find that science has not informed development. This is the biofuels, because now oil palm is a major driver in mangrove loss. Malaysia, Indonesia, and where else. And the premise here is that using biofuels, you shift from fossil fuels and you solve the carbon problem. But way back in 2008, a review paper by Faringer et al. In Science Express, they reviewed all the different biofuel production systems, corn, palm oil, etc. in different habitats, peatlands, savannas, rainforests, abandoned croplands, marginal, and so on. And they found that for peatlands, forests, savannas, you would create a carbon debt by producing biofuels. A carbon debt is that you release more carbon, from the greenhouse gas savings that you would have by shifting to biofuels from fossil fuels. If you produce biofuels in peatlands, of course, you have to release the carbon from the peats. From tropical rainforests, you have to clear the above ground biomass and the below ground biomass. It was only in abandoned croplands, marginal lands, that you would have real, genuine savings for carbon. Now, this was in 2008, and it does not inform policy in the Philippines anyway, and in other Southeast Asian countries, the governments, it's there. Still, we have this conversion of peatlands, still ongoing, of mangroves for oil palm. So the science is not informing policy, and that is such a shame.
Okay, if you want to go to the next question, we can, but if you want to answer, it's okay.
Should I say first or
Okay,
take
yeah,
the question first? Take it, wait it.
Okay, one more.
Hello. Is it on? Hi. Thank you again for being up there and for all the years that you've contributed to conservation. You guys inspire me. My question really is: we all agree that we need a holistic approach to conservation. I mean, we talk about community-based, science-based, and advocacy and everything. But in your opinions, do you think that any one organization can take all of that on, or should we, one person or one organization work on one side of it while another one takes on the maybe more habitat focus and some more species focus? But I just don't really see enough cooperation. That sometimes we're fighting for the same things as conservationists. So because you've worked so many years in this industry, do you see a future where we can have like a platform where we can all kind of just attack this problem from every direction, but working together? Thank you.
For us in the northern Sierra Madre, or at least who works for Philippine Crocodile, is easy because we are the only active organization working in our site. But we use the wetland ecosystem approach to save the Philippine crocodiles, and because we believe that if we protect the wetlands, we are not just protecting the Philippine crocodiles, but also other wetland resources such as fish, where people depend on. And so if you protect that, including the buffer zones, and basically you're doing from ridge to reef. You start there and then going up. So what we're trying to do is that even if we are a very small organization, we don't go into a very large project which we cannot do. Right now, for example, there is a very big USAID project which is operating in the same area as we are. We work together, and we work not only with the non-government big organizations, but also with the governments. It is hard to work with politicians, like Jurgenne is saying, but that I think as a community organizer, I learned how to deal with them. You know, sometimes being a person in the community, it's you know, if you cry, if you need to cry, you have to cry. But if you need to say hooray because you achieved something, then just do it. I think that will work. But you know, working with everyone who are there, be it big or small, just work together and don't work on the same team.
One more response before we take a question.
Yeah, I think there clearly, in some cases, there clearly overlaps with the work that's going on for conservation, but I think increasingly, as people working in conservation, we're getting a little bit better. To some extent, it is also because of the requirements by donor agencies. For wildlife trade, at least, a lot of the larger agencies like the US government or the UK government, they expect you to work with your partners. The IUCN a couple of years ago established the Asian Species Action Partnership, and that is very much based on a partnership-based approach. A lot of NGOs and research institutions, zoos have come on board, and I think I mean, the idea of a partnership is that each one tackles a specific problem, but you all come together to achieve a specific objective or an overarching objective. In Malaysia, we are working through a partnership for tigers, for example, through the Malaysian Conservation Alliance for Tigers. So I think, I mean, obviously there's so many benefits to working through a partnership, and it's easy to sometimes be competing with one another. When the space is so small, but I think things are improving. We just have to find a way to make sure that even if we're competing, if it's not making us better, we just have to try and make sure that we're not wasting resources.
Take a question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. I have a question. Earlier you said that people and science are the most important part for conservation in general. In the frame of areas where people are not very interested in conservation, such as humongous cities, and when you are working with species that are not extremely charismatic, as Mirza pointed out, how do you involve people? How do you make people interested, and how can they be beneficial to projects? Thank you.
So I think there have been a number of talks at this conference talking about involvement of public at large, even in rather small and uncharismatic species, such as tiny frogs or small primates and so on. So I think it is I think I agree with the passion part of it. I really like that point. You know, when you impart that passion to young people, even you know, small uncharismatic species become very interesting. And I think that whole model of scientists now, you know, without losing the rigor of their work, being able to go out and educate people and impart that passion about species to younger people, it's really, really important. And I think that's really the only way to go, because in India, for instance, you know, a huge country with many research institutions and universities, haven't been able to create the kind of passion that now a large number of grassroots level NGOs and independent scientists have been able to do. So I think it's you know, and I find personally, I work in the area of you know, also of trying to develop bird-based tourism, which is very important in the mountains. And I find that even people who never came in with interest in birds, you know, one bird walk can just change everything for them, even change lives, particularly for younger people. So I think there's a lot to be done there. a lot to be said for scientists reaching out, communicating, and spending at least 20 to 25% of their time writing in the popular press, taking people for walks, showing them, species and wild habitats. And I think that's where we're going to make the difference in the next 5 years.
One more.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm an academic, so mostly what I do is science. But in Indonesia, as part of the scientific community, I have a good relationship also with the government, especially in this case, the Ministry of Forestry. And they usually ask for advice on certain matters related to conservation, especially on amphibian and reptiles. And in my case also, because if you can say it's my organization, but the Indonesian Herpetological Society is mostly consists of scientists working in the university and also in the museum. But we also think that young generation should know more, so we try to engage them. A lot of young people now into social media, so we open an FB, Facebook groups, and we have a newsletter, and we try to always include them, and it's worked. And also sometimes some experience can increase the popularity. For instance, a few months ago, we have a peculiar president, new president, one now, and he loves frogs. It is good, isn't it, if you think about it? Because he said that he loves to hear the voice of the frogs. So, and he lives now in Bogor, in this big, istana. And what happened is this, because he loves frogs, he wants to hear, but he doesn't really know local frogs. So he released the full frogs, which is very bad because it's an invasive species. So it's a big outcry in the public, including from us. So the Ministry of Forestry come to us and we talk about it. It can be, and it actually raised the profile of the frogs, even though it started in the wrong way. But we think that it's a good point. We just realized, okay, people know frogs, and we have to tell them what is the real frog that we have, the amphibian that we have, the good one. We have much better species than the bullfrogs, so it can work.
So we're going to take one last question. We'll take Surin, because I know she can ask later, but Surin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to find out from you whether being a champion for species conservation is like being a marathon runner, 4 times 100-meter runner, or 100-meter dash runner. I know it's not an either or game, but I just like your perspective.
One response. Is it conservation? Is it a long battle, or is it you do it in short spurts? Or is it a long battle?
It's slow for me.
Doing conservation work sometimes has, there are ups and downs. For example, in our case for Philippine crocodile conservation, we started with 12 individuals in 2001 without any sanctuaries, and now in 2015 we have 84 counts in the wild after how many years, and we have 35 in our Head Start facility. It's the population is increasing, but we need a lot of effort to do it, especially for Philippine crocodile, which is not very charismatic. But then again, if you involve the people, they will love the crocodiles. And there are no killings as of last year.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, I'll make it short. When we're talking about species conservation, I feel insects should be part of the game. They are the most species-rich group on the planet, probably the most important in terms of ecosystem services. And 2 people here at least, Reuben, who used to work on snails, and Ghazala, you also work on insects, more charismatic ones. So just like to hear out what advice might you have on making insect conservation more mainstream.
Anybody works on insects? Well,
say something because I'm a trained zoologist. Yes, you know, in the universe, you know, each species has its place. So, of course, insects, you know, no matter how small the plant or animal or even the microorganism, you know, they have their places. But my take on this is that if you have, I started off by saying that I'm the odd woman out here because I go for ecosystems, the whole mangrove ecosystem. If you conserve an ecosystem, then everybody, you know, gets conserved, big and small, charismatic or not, and they are there, no? So maybe it shouldn't be an either or, either the ecosystem or the species approach. You know, there should be a room under the sun for everyone, for all approaches. I'd like to go back to that first question that David asked. If you were to, somewhere there anyway, if you were to, yes, advise a 25-year-old, my advice would be, now that I'm ×3, almost ×3 that age, would be you have to love what you do. You know, you have to love it. Otherwise, what's the point in living a life? So I started off as a zoologist. So in Mindanao, where you have you know, war, and so I had to evacuate to Central Philippines because there was fighting, and you know, so I had to do aquaculture to survive, for my family to survive. So that was shrimp culture. And eventually I found out that it was the shrimp culture that was killing all the mangroves. So I love trees. I was imprinted on trees. So I said I have to get away from this. So that's how I shifted to mangroves, despite my being a zoologist. And now I'm into trees, native trees, and so on. But I think you have to love what you do. The passion will be there. Otherwise, if you do it for money, you know, yeah, maybe it's nice to have lots of money, but in the end, I don't think money can bring you joy.
One last word from the before we wrap up.
So I agree with Anuj. I mean, insect conservation is actually one of the areas which is really neglected. But to the younger people here, I would advise that it's a great area to work in because you can get fantastic sample sizes in a very short period of time. You don't have to trek more than 1 or 2 kilometers to do your work every day. So, and insects that get active during the day, I mean, you can get up late and go trap butterflies at 9 a.m. And it's amazing. I mean, once you get into the area, it's just truly amazing, the diversity and you know, the kind of life cycles they have, and it's an amazing area to get into. So I would really encourage people to get into that as well, invertebrate conservation.
I think I'll wrap up now, short of time. I'm going to give an example, case study of my work in Malaysia, and I'm going to try to summarize all the lessons learned from our distinguished panel. And starting from Anuj's question, is it difficult to work on invertebrate conservation? Yes, it is. I started out working on snails, couldn't get enough funding to work on snail conservation, but when I was in the jungle, I started to appreciate the larger ecosystem, and I thought that it would be better to work on something larger to help save the forest. So then I went to tigers because I joined an NGO, and I got interested in tigers because I saw using it as umbrella species, you can really help protect the ecosystem. And for tigers, they're not doing too well at the moment in Southeast Asia. As you all said, trends for critically endangered species are going down. Some are recovering. Some successes in Philippines, but for tigers, not doing too well at the moment. Started off with a species-specific approach, trying to save tigers. And tigers getting pictures of tigers will win some hearts in the government. You know, it will raise eyebrows and get attention from politicians. But after a while, we've got to think of the bigger picture. So I went from a species approach to then now a landscape approach, where I'm trying to save the forest. And it's not easy. As Surin pointed out, I think it's a marathon. You get jaded after a while sometimes, but you need to recharge. By coming to conferences like this, you know, meeting like-minded people, very important. And listening to your stories today, I feel very inspired and encouraged. And I just want to thank you for all your work you've been doing. And I think the audience would like to put a hand for these people. Again, above all is passion. You're going to love what you do, Jurgenne, you're right. You're going to love what you do and keep at it. And with enough funding and political will, I think we can make a difference and save the habitats and species we're trying to protect. All right, thank you very much. And time for this.